Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our user group session on LiveMap's V8 summary dashboards. I'm Andrea Easton, the Customer Success Manager for North America, and the session is going to be led by Chris Millay, our Support Manager today. As usual, the session is going to be in two parts. First part will be Chris reviewing summary dashboards. Then we'll open the session up for any questions you may have. So to raise your hand, you can press the hand button, and we can unmute you if you want to go on speaker, or you can just type your question in the chat. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today's topic is on summary dashboards, specifically our version 8 summary dashboards. We do plan to have the next one, which will actually start covering our V10 summary dashboards as they're finally coming into play. I'll have more on that in a little bit. So normally it's Justin and myself doing these sessions, but Justin had a prior commitment, so unfortunately you're just stuck with me today. So on that, we're not going to cover every widget that's in there. We're going to kind of explain what the summary dashboards are, kind of go through all those, but we are going to cover certain widgets in there, like the heat map, alerts, dealing with the performance widgets themselves. There's 3 of them really. And then I'll go a little bit more in depth on the SQL and the PowerShell and some of the rules that you have to follow in order for those to work. After that, we'll do a Q&A session, which will kind of open up the floor. You guys can, if you want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand, and I'll unmute you, and you go ahead and tell us your question, or you can just type in a question if you don't want to talk on the microphone. Either way. And then last but not least, but we'll do a little bit of sneak peek into what V10 is going to look like some more. So that seems to be an ongoing theme with these as we continually progress through the V10 development cycle. So off to the lab. So let me get myself set here. So what I'm doing this time is I've actually gone into our demo environment for our summary dashboard. In a previous session, we had done something on a user group where we created a user group service and had the end user of the application and the infrastructure and created a group for that for all the computers. And sometimes that's great. And while you can show performance data on those things, sometimes a technical team or somebody needs to have a little bit more information about that. And that's usually where summary dashboards come into play. So to start off with, summary dashboards from the menu, most of you guys will see the Create Summary Dashboard at the very top. And if you don't see this, then you're not logged on as a SCOM admin. Just like all of our other dashboards, in order to create them, you do have to be a SCOM admin. Down the list, if there's any in the setup, then you'll start seeing those particular dashboards that are already created. So this one down here happens to be the one that we created from our first session first thing this morning. We basically did a heat map, so top 10 CPU, memory, performance information. It appears that we did forget to talk about the alerts one, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one from scratch so you guys can see that. Except for I'm going to target a little bit differently than we did in the first session so that I can get a little bit more data into it so you can see how it goes. So to start off with, I'm going to go ahead and create a new summary dashboard. When you create a dashboard, the refresh is still going on in the background. While we've kind of paused it for what you're seeing, there is some refresh functionality that still is occurring, and I'll kind of explain a little bit of why that's important to know that in a little bit. But most people, when they want to start off, they usually start off with a heat map. So, well, I guess I should have probably given it a title first. I'll cover that in a second. So a heat map is it takes up one of the spaces for the widgets. So every widget requires a title. So in this case, I could do something like server health. Now, object type, you can run down the list of objects. You can start typing in what you're after. I'm going to leave it at Windows Server, but if you want to, you can look up IIS websites. The one thing about these widgets is they can only target one particular object type at a time, or one particular class at a time. That'll change a little bit in V10, but for this is how it's targeted for right now. Scoping it to a group. So if instead of, if I leave this as just Windows Server and I don't scope it to a group, then you're basically going to get all of the servers in your environment. In the case of this morning, if you have a certain group, so like computers for that user group service, that will bring up just those particular servers that are in that group. For the case of this one, just so that I have, since it's a small environment, I'm going to go ahead and leave this at all Windows computers. So that way I get a little bit more data involved in my summary dashboard. Now, group membership basically included the members and sub-members. That's our default setting. We did have a setting for including members only. This was kind of a use case scenario where we had to target different classes that people have kind of renamed the Windows computer class. So most times this is all you need to do. There are a couple use cases where you do have to target the other one. Object name. In this case, I don't necessarily need to display the object name because it is going to be, or actually I can display the object name, which is going to be the computer itself. If you were targeting something like the Windows operating system, then chances are you don't necessarily want to show Windows operating system as the first entry in there. You may want to show the path, which the first entry in the path is usually going to be your host or your server. So depending on the normal entries in the path, you can display a lot more that's in there. So in the case of like a logical disk, sometimes you want to show the object name, which will only be, you know, C colon or you know, D colon, but then also show the path to show what computer it's actually on. So for right now, I can leave this alone and then hit save. What that's going to do is produce the server health tile that's there. So now I have a widget. So that's in there. And now you'll notice that I can expand this out. You know, I can shrink it up. You know, if I want to expand it out a little bit further, you'll notice that we kind of auto populate this into different columns depending on the size. You know, as I go across, now I have 4 columns. So most of the time, considering the number that I'm holding, I'll just go ahead and keep it at this size for right now. So that's server health, or that's your heat map. The next common one that we kind of deal with is actually going to be the performance related ones. So top end computer, this is one that's generated and looks for certain CPU, memory, things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead and put in you know, CPU because that's what I'm after in this case. Time span, I'm going to change this to 1 day, but you can leave it at 1 week, and I'll show where that's a little bit important here in a moment. You can scope it to a group just like before. You know, if I do all Windows computers, and then I'll get at least all the ones in my environment. CPU metrics, memory available, used, process queues, some basic ones. You'll notice the one that's missing in here is actually something like disk space or something along those lines. For those, we actually have to go to the top end advanced. This one is specifically targeting metrics that are commonly in your Windows operating system metrics. I'm going to leave it as a spark line so I can show trending information. And you know, the key when you're talking about a top end, especially with CPU, then I'm obviously concerned about largest values. I'm not necessarily concerned with the smallest values. So I'm looking for the ones that are taking up the most CPU. If I was doing this when I do the top end advanced, you'll notice that I'll actually pick you know, smallest values because I'll be looking for something more along the lines of those that I'm dealing with that are disk space related, because that's where my concern is. And then of course you can choose the top numbers to display. So it defaults to 5, but if I want to, I can put 10 in here, and then I'll save it. Now when it first populates up, it'll show you the most CPU at top, because that's where I told it to do the largest. But you basically hit the server names and then the percentages. If I expand this out 1, then you'll see that's where I get the spark line. That's where that 1 day comes into play. The number here on the side will always be the last value that we see within the data warehouse. So it won't necessarily be the peak or anything along the line. It's usually just the last value that is actually currently running. So every time this page refreshes, it'll go get new values. Now that leads me to top end advanced. Top end advanced is a little bit more, it has a lot more options on here. So in this case, I can do, logical disk or disk space or however you want to do it. I'll target my logical disk server. It's the most common one done. I can scope this to a group. I'll do the all Windows computers again. just so I know which ones I'm getting. And now the metric is going to be whatever metrics relate to the particular class that you have. In this case, I have logical disk free space, or I can do logical disk, free megabytes. I only have it. This is only a small 2012 environment, running server 2012. It hasn't been upgraded to 2016 at all yet. But if I had those, you would see the different metrics that are in here. So I'll go ahead and leave this as logical disk free megabytes. Let me get that out of there. Instead of doing the spark line, this time I'll do a bar graph. Disk space doesn't usually change all that much. I'll leave it at 1 day. Of course, now I'm mostly concerned with the smallest values, because you obviously want the lower the amount, the more concern you have in this case. I'm going to leave the display name so that I can see, the C drive, D drive, or whatever, but now I'm going to add the first entity path so I can see what server it's running on. Now, unit specified. If you don't specify unit, it's basically going to leave it. If we know the default, we'll add it in there. Sometimes, if I run this one, I may get values that say like 84K or something like that. Basically, it's saying 84,000 megabytes. But if I come in here and actually tell it that the one that I'm looking for is actually in megabytes, then this will help translate it into megabytes, or if it needs to, go into terabytes or so forth. Now, top N, in this case, that's actually a bottom N. I can go ahead and leave it at 10. I could put 11, however I feel like I want, and I can save this. Now, this will go grab the disk space, and you see here I've got 67 gigabytes worth of space on that one. If I expand this out, you'll now see that I actually have a bar graph. So it's just kind of a different way of displaying the same data. So actually, I will expand it out so I can fill up my space here. So the next one I'll cover is actually the performance graph. Performance graph will kind of try to display things out as you see. So I'm going to do this one as CPU again, but this one I have to actually tell it, Windows operating system. I can scope it to my group, Windows computers. We do recommend scoping these to groups, by the way, unless you have a small environment or only a finite number of details. If you have thousands of computer objects that you're monitoring, then doing something like this may take a while for it to load. So I just kind of advise on that. Now here I'll pick my processor time. I can tell it, do I want the average? Do I want the minimum? Am I looking for maximums? In this case, I'll go ahead and choose maximums because that's really what my concern is going to be. I can leave it for 1 week. I can change this to a day if I want, all the previous day. Largest values. Considering I'm doing the operating system, I probably don't really want to show that that's what I'm pulling it from. So I'll actually change this to just the first path, so I can just see the server itself. Now, unit specified, this is technically going to be in percents anyway. So now I'll save this. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that it's kind of small. So I always find it best on the performance ones to expand this out so that I can see more information and get a better view of that particular performance data. Now, one of the other things that is commonly done here is, hey, I have targeted a group that has 12 computers in it. Why am I only seeing 6? That's something that we've kind of hard-coded into this particular widget itself. Since we're showing a lot of the graphs all together, we've kind of done a limit of 6 on purpose. So that way you basically don't get the big bowl of spaghetti. Now, that'll change in version 10. Version 10 will give you a little bit more options to tell you how many, or you can select how many of those lines you would like to have in this one. So there's a little bit of a change there when it comes to version 10. I will tell you this much though, that as this board refreshes, every time it does a refresh, it will turn around and go out and grab the latest value. So it's actually going to target the last known value in the database, and whatever that one is, it's going to turn around and give you, the next 6. So it can change through time as you go through. So what servers are displayed may change on the very next refresh. If there's one that now suddenly has more CPU usage than a previous one, that'll drop off. Now, the last widget I'll cover, at least in this area before I get to SQL and PowerShell, is actually alerts. There's two ways that we can display alerts. We can do an alert summary. Alert summary is a widget that actually will just kind of summarize the total number of alerts on a particular server or a particular object. So alert summary, if I want to target the Windows server, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and scope this to my all Windows computer group. I'll display 10. Display object name, that's fine. I don't necessarily need to worry about the path in this case. And here what you get is you basically get the objects themselves and the total number of alerts for that particular object. Now, if I want to see those alerts, I basically have to drill into the object to see what those alerts are. That's when you'll actually drill into the object explorer, so you can start looking at other bits of information. So that's kind of where that comes into play. Now, the other one, I'm going to go ahead and delete that widget. The other one that we have is alert details. Alert details will actually list out the alerts that you have. So in here, I can target my Windows server if I want to. I do want to scope this to, my all Windows computers. Now, what's nice about this one is we kind of give you, do I only want to show the top 100, warning, error, do I only want the ones that are new? Do I want those that are in a different resolution state? This will pull and look at what you have in your SCOM group. So if you have customizable ones, you can actually look at that. The one kind of caveat that I'll tell you about this one in particular is Windows Server. If you've got thousands of computers, this widget actually does take a long time to actually pull the data, because we have to look at each server to figure out any alerts for it. So one of the kind of tricks to this is not necessarily to pull an object type to say, okay, look, I want all Windows servers that are part of my, my all Windows computer group. If the object type ends up being the actual group name, so all Windows computers, this will actually come up faster, because in SCOM, the alerts actually roll up to the group itself. So I'm actually just looking at one object, and I'm still getting the same exact information. Now, if you're wanting something to pull in something like all alerts, like a logical entity or something like that, I find the best thing to do is actually target the all instances group, which basically is just a group of a bunch of groups. That will cover just about everything that's in SCOM. I have not found anything that hasn't been rolled up in those particular groups. So especially in larger environments, that will speed up this if you're wanting to look at a broad area of information. Again, you can scope it. I'll do the time span of the last day, but you can tell it, look, over the last week. This will look at the last time an alert has been modified. And now I can add this in here. And now I have those alerts here. Now, just like other things, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Oh, I forgot. This is one of those little caveats that are in here. We do require a name for the dashboard. So, so I have to give it some kind of a name, and now I can save it. One other kind of note on this particular one is that I did talk about that refresh that's going on in the background. One of the things that we've learned as we've gone through, as you are adding the widgets, please wait for the results of the widgets to come back before you start adding another widget. We have found that sometimes if that query is gone and you start adding another one, something gets lost in it, and when you save it, that widget may not show up, or may not know where to save it, or you may get an oops error. So it's always best to kind of wait till you get the results. Plus, it also gives you a little bit of an indication of how fast those results are going to come back. If you query something that's extremely large and it takes a long time to go back, that could add to the time that it takes to display your summary dashboard. One of the things that we do with our summary dashboards is, and why it seems like it takes a while for the dashboard to show up at times, is that we basically are pulling for all of the data on all of the widgets to get those back, and once we get them back, then we display the dashboard itself. That's going to change in V10, and I'll actually go through that little preview, that sneak peek, here in a little bit. So here's kind of a basic rundown that allows you to see it. I have my health, alerts, I have some performance counters, I have a performance counter. On all of these, once it's loaded, I can turn around and actually filter things out. This is not persistent when it comes to the filter. It's not like I can save it that way. It's one of the things that are in there that allows you to kind of, as a user, filter things out on the fly. The other thing I like to note in this little area, you'll notice here that my CPU, I'm only at 2.54%, but yet my object itself is showing red. And that's because we're showing the object of the computer or the operating system that, in this case, this is probably the computer in its case because of what I pulled. That's the health of that particular computer, not necessarily because of a performance counter or something along those lines. Now, before I go on to SQL and PowerShell, there is one other kind of neat feature that showed up kind of by our developers. They basically came up with something, put it in place, and then after we saw it, we started to like it and realized that it's kind of a hidden feature on some of these summary dashboards. If you go into Object Explorer, this is going to be as of version 8.7 or greater. Object Explorer is basically class-based, so I can look at all of the objects of a particular class. Think of it as the discovered inventory in your SCOM console. So I can go through and type in Windows Computer, and I can go grab all of my Windows computers. The nice part about this is that I could also do something like I can do the logical disk server and pull all of those objects in here too. Now, what you can't do with this is actually export this to or scope it to a group. It's really just class-based as it is. From here, you can do a search. So if I wanted to do C:, that wouldn't really make sense because of what I've pulled, but you can filter things out based on the object name. I can also filter out all of my greens. So here I want to show just my red or grays or yellows or things of that nature. So you can change this up. I can also change my sort order. Instead of sorting them by health state, I can change it so that they sort alphabetically. So now you can see that it changes up just a little bit. This is really handy, especially when you're talking about pulling in something like the All Live Map Services class, which is all of your services. So if you wanted to create a service dashboard that is alphabetically geared, then you can do it this way. It's not our all service dashboard, but it does allow you to pull things in and resort them alphabetically a little bit. Now, came all this way to explain there's this export feature. If you export this will actually export it into a summary dashboard. So here I can do give it whatever I want, and then I can tell it to create the dashboard. I can also copy this link and add it into a, if I copy this link, I can add that into our web page widget, because that's really what we're doing. So if I tell it to open this dashboard, you'll notice that I'm opening up a summary dashboard, and it's basically created this web page, a web page widget. I can come in here and edit this, and if I want to, I can shrink this up, change the size of this, and now add other widgets as I see. So you can, this is one way to have a class-based kind of filter out automatically the greens and stuff like that. This is probably most useful. Things like the health service watchers, things of that nature. If you're trying to figure out whether your computers are up and running, that itself could be helpful. Okay, so let me go ahead. I'll save that. Well, yeah, save that one. And I'm now going to go back to, oh, not that yet. I'm coming to this one. All right, so this particular dashboard is all PowerShell and SQL queries. That's really all it is. Couple things on here as I go through. So all of these up here are all PowerShell, and these two down here are SQL. Although you can display your SQL the same way I'm displaying this targeted gauge or as this single value. Let me put myself in edit mode and I'll kind of explain what I've done here. So one of the nice neat things that came about the PowerShell widget is the ability to kind of have a notepad. So I now can just write things as a note if I want to. If I need to have information displayed on a page, then that gives me at least one way to do that. Now, the reason why this is in here is so that I can create an error condition. If your script has an error in it or creates an error condition when something occurs, you'll notice that we actually show the title bar in red, and it will basically give you an indication and show you the error message itself. So that's kind of one way to see how things are running. I'll move over to here. So the common way to show things when your default is going to be a single value. Now, you'll notice in this particular script, all I'm doing is getting my SCOM alerts. Because this one is not running on the management server itself, it does mean I have to include the import module operations manager, and I do have to create a connection back to my operations manager. If this was running on the management server, those two sections are not really needed. I could just put get SCOM alert, resolution state 0, and I'm perfectly fine. Now, the one thing about this is this is single value, and since it's pulling in a lot of information, you'll notice that it pulls that out and actually shows it as kind of a JSON output. Not very useful for most people. So this right here is the same thing, except for what I've done is I've added this out string command to make sure it's formatted as a string, and now I actually get this actually to look up like kind of the output you'd get from PowerShell. In V10, we've got a little bit different way of doing this, and like I said, I'll show that in the sneak peek as I go through stuff. So I'm going to save this. Now, this one here is also a single value. I basically have done the same thing, but I've gone through and grabbed myself a count of things. A little bit different way of doing things. Sometimes people just want a count of the information. And one of the things about PowerShell that I need to note is that we're running this as the app pool user. So whatever your app pool that's running your Live Maps portal, that's the permissions that need to be kept for that person. So if you're trying to do something through let's say you're trying to do like a Hyper-V or connect to some other system, that user has to have those permissions to be able to do so. One other little kind of trick that we've done here recently is in order to get some of the permissions we needed, you almost had to make the user a domain admin, which is not something I recommend. So what we did is we actually had a script fire off on the local computer that created basically a text file, and we read the information in and then displayed the data that way. So it's almost like a two-step process. So our permissions really only needed to be to read the file that was necessary in the folder structure. So that's another way to kind of get past some of those issues that you may run into there. Now, this one is the same kind of output, but it's more in a grid. So you'll notice I did this as a grid view. The other thing I forgot to talk about is there is a time limit on the PowerShell. So it defaults to 30 seconds, and then if it displays that and runs out of time, it'll actually show it up as a warning. Basically, the title bar will go yellow. You can change that to something else. So if I change it to healthy, it'll actually show up green. So you have some other options there if the timeout occurs. In order to kind of narrow things down, I've basically told it I only want to have certain fields or columns. If you don't do something like this, then you'll get all of them, and you end up having a grid that is extremely long. Now, I forgot I'm in edit mode, and basically have to scroll through a lot of useless information. So it is helpful to grab just the information that you need. A targeted gauge is, this was actually a feature request that came through for our SQL side. We just kind of went ahead and added it into PowerShell. Gives you a single gauge that you can put a target. You can put a maximum, and then you give it an actual count of something, and this will turn around and give you this kind of gauge where you can see where you're at, what number you're at, and where you sit in the gauge. So this is PowerShell and how we show PowerShell, at least in version 8. SQL is pretty much the same thing as far as a grid. It can also show things as a single value if you are returning just a single value. If you return something that has more than one value, it's only going to show the first. Unlike the PowerShell that has a tendency to show things in JSON, the SQL one will basically show you a single value, whichever one's the first one to return. But it can also show something as a targeted gauge. So if I come into this one, you'll notice you have to give it a title. Defaults to just looking at the Operations Manager data warehouse. You can do a custom query, or we do have some about 3 canned responses based on Kevin Holloman's blog articles. Now we do are looking for more, obviously, but you can grab this and then show it up as a grid. And save that information. We'll go to SQL and grab the information and show it up as a table. I can do the same thing over here. This one I've actually targeted instead of the Operations Manager. I've gone through, you can either do Oracle or SQL Server. Give it the database, obviously, or database server, the actual database. If you choose Windows authentication, it is going to use the app pool to authenticate, so you have to make sure that that user has permissions to read the data that you're after, at least a minimum of like DB data reader or something like that. Custom query, and then here's my query. You can see that it's just a simple query giving me the health status of the servers in my all Windows computer group, and then of course I'm showing this as a grid. So when I save that out, you'll see that I get the display name, the ID. We kind of put things in this little table to show this information. Now, this is the exact same query. By the way, there's a handout. If you guys look at your panel, there's a handout. There's one for PowerShell and one for SQL. Those are actually SQL queries and things that you're going to be able to do it in V10, for beta 2. We went ahead and decided to go ahead and hand that out to you a little early because I'll have some information on those that are interested in betaing version 10 here in a moment. So those are summary dashboards. Those are some of the more common ones of the widgets. We obviously have other widgets like an SLA widget and a web page widget and a couple others in there that may be useful. But those are the ones that are used the most, that most people are looking and targeting and pulling in information. If you scope those to groups that you've already created for like your services, then you get more of a technical dashboard that relates to that particular service that may be for a business owner or something along those lines. So now we will go here. So to recap, summary dashboards, we kind of covered the heat map, alerts, performance in SQL and PowerShell. So it's kind of a quick way of showing you different parts of the widgets themselves and how they relate to the summary dashboard. So don't forget the handouts. Those are more related to V10, but go ahead and grab those. They're actually going to be in part of the install for those people that are in beta. We'll do some question and answers here shortly. The V10 question, I knew that was coming. I'll answer that in a second, in a moment. Actually, I'll answer part of it right now. So the beta version, beta 2, we had a beta 1. It was a limited release only to about, I think about 6 customers that we really went through just to kind of make sure that the install and things like that worked. However, beta 2 is ready. There will be those people who have signed up will start getting emails starting probably Monday. The beta 2 release is ready to go out. So go ahead, and if you want to be part of beta, then feel free to sign up. You still have time to get into it. We have quite a few people already signed up, so it'll be really interested. The screenshot you see there, I'm actually going to show in detail in a moment as part of my release. But the actual release of beta 2, or the actual release of version 10, probably will not be, I think, more like July timeframe now. Obviously, we're just starting beta 2, so everything the developers are doing now is all going to be related to the RTM release, and no longer, working on anything with beta 2. So that's kind of where that's at. So the next user group session, we're actually going to cover some of the V10 summary dashboards. I'm going to give you a sneak peek at that right now. So hold on, I'll show that in just a second, and then you guys can see some of the things that are going to be possible on that end. So this is version 10. I don't know if anybody has not been on any of the other user groups, you'll notice the first thing that this is the home page. We've changed the home page and made the home page a summary dashboard on its own. So you can actually change this up and make it look the way you want it to look based on the widgets that you decide to deploy. Some of these are HTML widgets, which is another way to have a notepad, but also gives you a little bit more flexibility of doing things. So let's go into the PowerShell one. One of the big differences in between the old version and the new version is going to be that each widget will kind of operate independently. I'm kind of hitting on the server, and each one of these is going out and grabbing information and trying to hit the SDK. So I had this problem earlier today where they seem to go for a little while, so I'm hoping there it goes. So obviously what I did is these are all the same information, just slightly different. Grid is the same thing, is kind of showing it as, I've got a console here. Grid is a grid. The difference here is I can actually do a sort if I want to. I can actually export the data if I want to through a grid. I can show the information as a heat map. Come through here. We are giving you the flexibility to actually change the view from an end user, itself. If I want to, I can actually come through and change this to more of an entity state, or, I could go back and show the grid view if I want to see that information. So you do have options as one developing the dashboard. You can lock this down to one particular view, or you can turn around and open it up to others. I will tell you a couple things about beta 2 on its own. So this is a graph view that I wanted to do. This was in development, but that is actually not part of beta 2. The other one that's not in beta 2 as far as this is our HTML view. But those are ones that are looking to actually be in our RTM release. They got to fix a few bugs that are in those views. But I've got a pie chart that allows me to show, like, these are the total number of servers that are currently in my environment, what the health status of those are. Where the single value was there, I can now show multiple single values in the same widget. The bullet graph is the same thing as the targeted graph, except for now I can show multiple ones at the same time. If I put this into edit mode, you'll notice some of those were already starting to refresh. I'm actually going to come down to this one to edit. You have an option for a no results message, so you can put your own message instead of no data. You can have it actually give like a big thumbs up, or however you feel like you'd like to. Views, you have the option to lock down views. Like I said, there's some of these that are not in beta 2, like the bar graph or the HTML for PowerShell. And then data is basically, you'll notice that it's a little easier to read because we use IntelliSense on this. We're actually color coding it, so it's a little easier to read than just plain text. There is a sample section. It's not in beta 2, but for those that actually want to, if you have good PowerShell that you'd like to show and have in there as a sample, whether it's related to SCOM or something else, if you're willing to share that with us, we're willing to put it in a sample section so that we can turn around and show that give people some flexibility to add those PowerShell scripts right away, instead of having to download those or type them in or something along those lines. We want to give people the ability to just kind of select from an option here. Now, there are requirements for each one of these views. So if I come over here to the help, you'll notice that each type of view has its own requirement. So the hardest one is going to be PowerShell, that if you want to show multiple views, you may have to make sure you include data formatted a couple different ways to make sure that they have the ability to switch from one to the other. This could get a little interesting, especially how each one has its own requirements. So it's not as simple as just saying, hey, yes, I want that view to be available also. That's not so much when you're talking about other widgets like performance or some of the other ones, the ones that we've built in natively, but for PowerShell and SQL, it's a little different. One of the other nice things about this is that if I pull in data and I actually show the ID for something that's in SCOM, I can actually click on this and it becomes clickable directly into like the Object Explorer, even though it's just PowerShell. So the other one I'll show here is actually the SQL widget, or the SQL testing that I did on here. Kind of the same views. These views are pretty much going to be commonplace across the way when it comes to the way we want to format this, and give a lot more color options and ways to format the data. You'll notice that I actually go beyond my field of view here, because we're actually going to limit you on the number of widgets, not necessarily on disk or screen space. So you'll have options to actually add more data below the title bar or below the footer, so that if you want, they can scroll down and get more information. Yep. So let's see here. That's pretty much what I wanted to show on these. Other things that I've shown, I'd already previously shown on here. So that was actually getting data from a different database. This is what a performance line graph now looks like. I've actually expanded this out. By the way, I can turn around and I can change how much space this actually takes up. Instead of taking up, there's now 6 across instead of 4. The other nice thing about this, you have options to turn, let me go back out of edit mode. So this is only grabbing certain information, but I can actually turn certain ones off. So if I really want to see the data, even though it is a big bowl of spaghetti, I can turn around and come into something like this. So HTML widget, here I'm actually combining multiple bits of data all on one, which is why I had to expand it out so it took up a little bit more space. You'll notice I'm looking at free space and available megabytes all in the same one. Not exactly the best way to put something in there, but at least you can see I've actually got more than just the 6 performance graph metrics. But I can turn around and actually change those. Which one's the one at the top? It's blue. There it goes. I knew I'd get to it eventually. And you can see how it just it'll change itself to relate to what I'm actually trying to show. Anyway, so that's it. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone. Thank everyone for attending. Hopefully you got useful information both for V8 and hopefully, as always, we're trying to get people excited for V10. I know if you're like me, I can't wait for the V10 stuff to come out. So, which is why our next user group session here in June 21st is. Yep, that one will be actually over the widgets that are in V10. Obviously, it's a kind of a precursor to the actual release, so that will be before the actual release most likely, because I don't think we'll have the release done by then. Maybe, I don't know. Probably looking towards the end of June, sometime in July before the actual release of V10. So at least that's my guess. I don't know anything officially, so we'll kind of stake it from there. So thank you for attending, and yep, have a good day.
Great job, Chris, going solo today. Thanks.
All right.